During a heartfelt town hall, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. listens to a veteran's gut-wrenching story of loss and struggle. Overcome with emotion, he wipes away tears as the crowd watches in silence. What he does next leaves everyone in shock, sparking national headlines. This raw and powerful moment showcases his unfiltered response, proving why his leadership continues to captivate millions. The hall was packed. Hundreds had gathered, waiting to hear Robert F. Kennedy Jr. speak. But no one expected what was about to happen. In the middle of the event, an elderly man with trembling hands stood up. His voice was shaky, yet strong. "Sir," he said, looking straight at RFK Jr., "I have carried this pain for over 50 years." The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. The veteran took a deep breath. "Vietnam, 1968. I was just a kid, sent to a war I didn't understand. We were told we were fighting for freedom, but all I saw was death. I lost my best friend in my arms. He was just 19. RFK Jr. blinked fast, trying to hold back tears. The man's voice cracked. "We came back, but no one welcomed us. People called us monsters. They spit on us, and now I sit alone in a tiny apartment wondering if it was all worth it." A single tear rolled down RFK Jr.'s cheek. The veteran's pain was too real, too deep. But what he did next stunned everyone. RFK Jr. rose from his seat. His security guards hesitated, watching his every move. But he didn't care. He walked straight to the veteran and knelt before him. The old man's hands were shaking. His eyes, filled with years of sorrow, met RFK Jr.'s. The politician took the man's hand and held it tight. "You were never a monster," RFK Jr. said softly. "You were a hero." A muffled sob broke the silence. Someone in the audience wiped their eyes. Others shifted in their seats, unable to look away. The veteran swallowed hard. "Then why do I still hear their screams at night?" RFK Jr. took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. "Because no one ever helped you carry this pain." The old soldier's body shook. The weight of decades seemed to collapse onto him. RFK Jr. didn't let go. He squeezed the man's hand tighter. Then, something no one expected happened. The veteran broke down. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face as his body trembled. RFK Jr. did the only thing that felt right. He wrapped his arms around the man. For a moment, time froze. The cameras caught it all, an icon of power embracing a forgotten hero. The audience, once silent, now sniffled and wiped their faces. Then, the old man whispered something into RFK Jr.'s ear, something that sent chills through everyone listening. "I was going to end it all tonight. I had already decided, but now, maybe I won't." A gasp spread through the crowd. RFK Jr. pulled away, his hand still on the veteran's shoulders. "No," he said firmly. "You are not alone, not tonight, not ever again." The veteran clutched his chest and wept. The pain, the memories, the years of silence, they all poured out in front of hundreds. And just like that, the entire world watched a moment that no one would ever forget. The veteran wiped his face, but the tears wouldn't stop. His hands trembled as he clutched the microphone. "Do you know what it's like to hear your best friend beg for his mother while bleeding out in your arms?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. The silence in the room was unbearable. "I tried to save him," the old soldier continued. "I pressed my hands against his wound, but the blood wouldn't stop. He kept whispering, 'Tell my mom I love her.' Then, he was gone." The air felt heavy. Some audience members covered their mouths, their eyes glistening. RFK Jr. sat frozen, his hands clenched on the table. His usually strong voice had vanished. The veteran looked up, his lips trembling. "For 50 years I've had to live with that night. I see his face every time I close my eyes." A quiet sob broke out somewhere in the crowd. The veteran's voice cracked. "Do you know what hurts the most?" His mother never got to hear those words. RFK Jr. blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening. What he did next left everyone stunned. RFK Jr. leaned forward, gripping the table. His voice, low but firm, cut through the silence. What was his name? The veteran looked startled. His lips parted, but for a moment no words came out. Finally, he whispered, David. Private David Calloway. RFK Jr. nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. And his mother's name? The old soldier frowned. Margaret, but she must be gone by now. A strange determination crossed RFK Jr.'s face. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving fast. The audience murmured in confusion. Was he looking something up? Calling someone? Then he stood up. No mother should go to her grave without hearing her son's last words. His voice was thick with emotion. If she's still alive, I will find her. And if not... His voice caught. Then the world will know what David wanted to say. Gasps rippled through the audience. The veteran's lips quivered. His entire body shook. You would do that? RFK Jr. reached out, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. I give you my word. Tears spilled down the veteran's face. I've waited 50 years for someone to care. And then, RFK Jr. did something no one expected. RFK Jr. turned to his security team. Find her. His guards exchanged glances but nodded. One immediately stepped out, making calls. The audience sat in stunned silence. No one had expected this. The veteran's body trembled. His lips moved as if trying to speak, but no words came. Finally, he whispered, If she's gone, at least put his story somewhere people will remember him. RFK Jr. met his gaze, his voice steady. He will not be forgotten. The old soldier's shoulders shook. He covered his face with his hands. A woman in the front row openly wept. Even the cameraman wiped his eyes. Then RFK Jr. turned back to the audience. His voice, thick with emotion, carried through the hall. We always say we support our veterans, but when they needed us most, we left them behind. That ends today. Applause erupted, but it wasn't loud. It was slow, thoughtful, an applause filled with grief, understanding, and deep respect. The veteran looked up, his voice breaking. Thank you. RFK Jr. placed a hand over his heart. No, sir. Thank you. But little did they know. The hardest part of the journey was just beginning. The room still buzzed with emotion as RFK Jr.'s security team worked behind the scenes. Whispers spread among the audience. Could Margaret Calloway still be alive? Would she finally hear her son's last words? The veteran sat frozen, his wrinkled hands gripping the microphone. He looked drained, as if the weight of the past had finally crushed him. I just want to know, he whispered. I just need to know if she ever forgave us. RFK Jr. leaned in. Forgave you for what? The old soldier swallowed hard. For bringing her son home in a coffin. A hush fell over the room. The weight of war, of loss, of decades of unspoken pain. It all settled in the air like a storm cloud. Then, a voice came from the back. A security agent hurried forward holding a phone. His voice was urgent. We found her. The veteran gasped. His eyes widened, as if he had just seen a ghost. RFK Jr. grabbed the phone, his hands shaking, then he turned to the veteran. Are you ready? The old man's lips quivered. I don't know. But there was no turning back now. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a frail voice answered. Hello? RFK Jr. cleared his throat. Mrs. Calloway? Silence. Then the voice returned, shaky and hesitant. Who is this? RFK Jr. glanced at the veteran, whose eyes were filled with tears. He squeezed the old soldier's shoulder before speaking. My name is Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. I'm here with someone who served with your son in Vietnam. A sharp gasp interrupted him. David? Her voice broke. You knew my David? The veteran's whole body trembled. He grabbed the phone like it was his last chance at redemption. Mrs. Calloway, he whispered. I was with him that night. I was there. A sob echoed through the phone. The entire audience held their breath. "Ma'am," the veteran choked out. "He wanted you to know. He loved you. His last words were for you." A wail came from the other end of the line. Decades of pain, of longing, of unanswered questions, now breaking free. Even RFK Jr. wiped his eyes. No one in the room could hold back their tears, but what Margaret said next changed everything. Through her sobs, Margaret whispered, "I always knew." The veteran's breath hitched. You knew?" She sniffled. "A soldier came to my door that day. He handed me a letter from David." Her voice trembled. "It said, 'Mom, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. But I want you to know, I love you.'" Tears streamed down the veteran's face. "He wrote that?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Yes, but I never got to hear it from someone who was there. I needed to hear it. From you." RFK Jr. blinked back tears. The room was silent except for the quiet sobs of the audience. Then Margaret said something that made the veteran collapse into his chair. "Son," she whispered, "I forgive you." The veteran clutched his chest, his body shaking. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Thank you." The weight he had carried for 50 years finally lifted. But their journey was far from over. The veteran held the phone to his chest. His hands shook as if the weight of Margaret's forgiveness was too heavy to bear. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. RFK Jr. leaned in. "Why do you think that?" The old soldier closed his eyes. "Because I promised David I'd get him home alive." His voice cracked. "And I failed." A deep silence settled over the room. The audience barely breathed. Even those watching the live stream online later would say they felt the same heaviness through their screens. Margaret's frail but firm voice came through the phone. "Son, listen to me." The veteran pressed the phone back to his ear, his lips quivering. "You did not fail him," she said. "David knew the risks. He went to war to protect his country. He went knowing he might not return, but he had you." She sniffled. "You were there for him when it mattered most. And now, after all these years, you're here for me." Tears rolled down the veteran's face. "I've carried this for so long." Margaret's voice softened. "Then let it go, child. Let him rest." RFK Jr. swallowed hard. "And let yourself rest, too." RFK Jr. wiped his eyes, but there was no stopping the emotion in the room. Even the toughest men in the crowd blinked back tears. Margaret's voice returned, softer now. "I always wished I could see his grave one last time." The veteran sat up straighter. "You've never visited?" She let out a shaky breath. "I did once, but I was young and strong then. Now, I can barely walk across my own living room." RFK Jr. straightened in his chair. "Where is he buried?" "Arlington," she whispered. "Section 60. A hush fell over the room. Section 60, the part of Arlington National Cemetery where America's fallen heroes from recent wars were laid to rest. The veteran clenched his jaw. "Mrs. Calloway, if you want to see your son's grave again, I will take you there myself." Gasps rippled through the audience. Margaret sobbed openly. "You would do that for me?" RFK Jr. stood up, his voice clear and unwavering. "We all will." The entire room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just applause, it was a promise. Margaret's wish would come true. 2 days later, the world watched as a black SUV pulled up in front of a small brick house in Ohio. RFK Jr. stepped out first. His presence was unmistakable. His voice, his stance, the quiet strength he carried. But this wasn't about him. This was about a mother's long-lost son. The veteran stepped out next, dressed in his best suit. His hands trembled as he approached the door. When it opened, a frail woman stood there leaning on a walker. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, her dress simple but elegant. And in her eyes, Years of sorrow, love, and longing. The veteran's voice broke. "Mrs. Calloway." She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his face. "Oh, my dear boy." Then she did something no one expected. She pulled him into her arms. The cameras caught it all. Social media exploded with the image of an elderly mother embracing an old soldier as if he were her own son. And in that moment, something in the veteran finally broke free. David was home. The journey to Arlington National Cemetery was quiet. The veteran sat beside Margaret in the back seat, their hands gently clasped together. Neither spoke much, but words weren't needed. RFK Jr. sat in the front, glancing at them through the rearview mirror. He had seen many powerful moments in his life, but nothing like this. As they neared Washington, D.C., a small crowd gathered outside the cemetery gates. News cameras were already in place, and reporters whispered into microphones. The world had been watching since the moment RFK Jr. made his promise. Margaret's frail fingers tightened around the veteran's hand. "I never thought I'd be back here," she whispered. The veteran swallowed. "I never thought I'd be worthy of bringing you here." The car stopped. A cemetery guide opened the door, and RFK Jr. stepped out first. Then the veteran. Then Margaret. She hesitated, staring at the vast rows of white headstones. "Take your time," RFK Jr. said softly. With great effort, Margaret took her first step. The world held its breath. Slowly, with the veteran at her side, she began her final walk to see her son. They reached section 60. The veteran led Margaret to a white stone, the name etched in perfect clarity. David Calloway, 1948, 1969, beloved son, forever brave. Margaret dropped to her knees, her frail body trembling. Tears fell freely down her cheeks. "My sweet boy," she sobbed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama's here." The veteran turned away, wiping his eyes. Even RFK Jr. pressed a hand against his chest, overcome with emotion. Margaret reached out, her fingers tracing David's name. "I have missed you every single day," she wept. "But I know now you weren't alone, you had him." She turned to the veteran, her eyes full of love. "You were his brother," she whispered. The veteran collapsed beside her, his body racked with sobs. "I should have saved him," he choked out. Margaret shook her head. "You carried his memory when I couldn't. You brought me here, and because of you, I can finally say goodbye." She kissed her fingers and pressed them to the stone. "I love you, my son. I'll see you again someday." The wind blew gently, as if David himself was answering. The world watched, hearts breaking, but no one expected what happened next. Just as Margaret wiped her tears, RFK Jr. stepped forward. He cleared his throat, his voice heavy with emotion. "There's something you both deserve to know," he said. The veteran looked up, confused. Margaret held onto his arm, her body weak but her eyes strong. RFK Jr. reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was old, yellowed with time. "I had my team look into something," he said, unfolding the paper. David Calloway was nominated for the Silver Star, for bravery. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The veteran's hands shook. "That can't be," RFK Jr. nodded. "It was lost in bureaucracy, never processed, until now." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, your son died a hero." Margaret let out a soft cry. The veteran's shoulders heaved as he clutched his chest. RFK Jr. stepped closer. David's honor was delayed, but today, that changes. He gestured to a soldier in dress uniform, who stepped forward carrying a velvet box. Inside gleamed the Silver Star. "For David Calloway," RFK Jr. said, "and for the man who carried his memory all these years." Tears poured down Margaret's face. The veteran shook as RFK Jr. placed the medal in his hands. A lifetime of pain, now met with honor. But the moment wasn't over yet. The cemetery was silent except for Margaret's quiet sobs. The veteran clutched the Silver Star, his fingers trembling over the cold metal. RFK Jr. stood beside them, his face etched with sorrow and respect. The cameras captured every second. The world was watching. A reporter, unable to hold back, whispered, "Sir, this is a moment history will never forget." RFK Jr. turned to the veteran. "Would you like to say something?" The veteran hesitated. His whole life, he had carried the weight of David's death. Now, in front of the world, he could finally speak. With a deep breath, he stood tall. "For years, I lived with guilt. I thought I failed him. I thought I failed Margaret. But today, I know the truth." He looked down at the medal, tears in his eyes. David died a hero, and now the world knows it too. Margaret grasped his hand. "And you, my dear, are a hero too," she whispered. The cameras zoomed in as tears streamed down the veteran's face. Across the nation, millions of viewers wiped their own eyes. But what RFK Jr. did next left everyone stunned. RFK Jr. turned to the veteran, his voice strong yet full of emotion. "Your story is not just yours. It belongs to every soldier forgotten, every family waiting for closure." He looked at the cameras. "This ends today." Then, in front of the world, RFK Jr. removed a small pin from his lapel. It was his own family's emblem, a symbol of honor and service. He pinned it on the veteran's chest. "From this day forward, your story will never be forgotten." Gasps echoed through the crowd. The veteran's lips quivered. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. RFK Jr. shook his head. "You deserve much more." Margaret touched the pin gently, her old hands trembling. "David would be so proud." The veteran fell to his knees, overcome with emotion. RFK Jr. knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. The cameras flashed. Social media exploded. Across the country, people stood up from their chairs, wiping their tears. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a movement. But RFK Jr. had one last surprise. 1 week later, a letter arrived at Margaret's doorstep. It was stamped with the presidential seal. Shaking, she opened it. Her breath caught as she read the words. "In recognition of David Calloway's bravery and sacrifice, the President of the United States officially awards him the Medal of Honor, posthumously." Margaret covered her mouth, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. The veteran held on to her as she trembled. A special ceremony was announced. RFK Jr. stood at the podium, the veteran beside him, his uniform pressed and neat. Margaret, sitting in the front row, clutched David's picture as the Medal of Honor was placed into her hands. The room erupted in applause. The veteran stood tall, his eyes glistening. For the first time in decades, his heart felt light. RFK Jr. stepped forward. "To everyone watching, remember this. Our heroes must never be forgotten. Their stories must be told." Then he looked straight into the cameras. "And if this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with the world. Let David's name be heard forever." And just like that, a single story became a legacy.